Well, kia ora everyone. It is great to be back up here again after a few weeks. And I'm really excited too that Grace City is jumping on board and joining us in Barnabas School of Leadership. So, it's a fantastic ministry. Roland and Elaine Foreman, who are my parents-in-law, actually launched it 8 years ago. And Rochelle and I have got more involved in it, and we're actually going to be taking over the leadership of that ministry come January. So that's something really exciting for us. We're still going to be involved here at Grace City, but also travelling a few times a year into Africa and Asia and helping to train. And that statistic, I don't know if you caught it at the beginning of that BSL video, only 5% of pastors in the developing world have any training. So most of you are better trained than 19 out of 20 pastors around the majority of the world. So we're just trying to play a small part in changing that. And if you'd be interested in finding out more, we'd love to see you at this coffee and dessert next Sunday night. So just grab that little invitation on your chair and grab the QR code and register. Registering, it's free. It's just so we know how much dessert to provide, because we don't want to provide heaps of dessert and then I've got to eat it all leading up to Christmas. That's never a good look. Hey, speaking of Christmas, we're in this series that JD launched last week for us. What child is this? And like John, I love the Christmas season. And one of the favourite things I love about it is these nativity plays that will happen all over the world involving truckloads of kids reenacting the story of Christmas. You know what I mean? There'll be a little girl that gets picked for the crucial role of Mary. And she'll get dressed up as Mary, and she'll be handed the little doll representing the baby Jesus, and she will have to be on the stage carefully cradling the little baby Jesus for the entire nativity play. And you hope that she'll continue to cradle Jesus and not hold on to Jesus by his leg or something like that. And then there'll be a little boy that's selected to stand protectively, kind of slightly behind Mary, to be Joseph, the earthly dad. And then there'll be a little boy or girl, either, to play the key role of the angel, who will appear to Mary and Joseph, and the angel will be all in white, and they'll have a key role in the story. And then there'll be a whole bunch more kids in white, maybe with wings, who are all dressed up as the rest of the angels, the choir, who come in at the right time and sing all the praise songs. And of course, they sing them to the shepherds. So there'll be a bunch of kids who are dressed in bathrobes and tea towels on their heads, and they'll be the shepherds. And they'll come at the right time, and they'll come near and in response to the angels and adore the newborn king. And of course, if you've got truckloads of kids, then you get some of them to crawl around the stage as the sheep. You know, meh. If you've got heaps of kids to use up, the sheep is a good way to have 6 or 7 kind of involved in the nativity play. And then at this point, the stage is full, but they'll squeeze on 3 more kids, won't they? And 3 children will appear towards the end of the nativity play with crowns on their heads and slightly more expensive clothing than the rest, and they will be carrying 3 very precious gifts for Jesus. And those 3 children will be the wise men. And it's the story of the wise men that we are coming to as we jump back into the series that JD launched last week. What child is this? I love the way that JD talked last week about the fact that in our Bibles we have 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. 4 Gospels is what we call them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Kind of like 4 biographies of Jesus. But what JD suggested last week is that these 4 biographies, these 4 Gospels, are kind of like 4 photo albums that have been put together by these 4 narrators, these storytellers, telling us the story of Jesus. And even when the photo albums have the same picture of the same event, they nuance them, or they present them slightly differently as they tell the story of Jesus. And out of the 4 photo albums, 2 of them tell us about Jesus' birth, Matthew and Luke. And in this series leading up to this Christmas, What Child Is This?, we're particularly looking at the way that Matthew tells the story of Jesus. We're looking at Matthew's photo album of the arrival of the King. And it's Matthew who tells us the story of these mysterious wise men, these magi. This is the way that he begins the story in Matthew 2, beginning in verse 1. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, what do we know about these mysterious figures that suddenly appear on the pages of the Bible? Well, almost 200 years ago, one of the well-known carols that we sing today was written about these very people. It was called We Three Kings. You know it? We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts we travel afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star. The truth is, though, that carol, as lovely as it is actually incredibly different from the story that Matthew wrote, the picture that he's put in his photo album. For example, let me just unpack 4 key ideas out of these opening verses very quickly. Who were the Magi, first of all? Well, the carol tells us that they were kings, but that's very, very unlikely. They were not kings. They're called Magi in the original word, and I like the fact the NIV uses that word here in our English translation. Magi is the word that we get our word magic from. So these were, in a sense, magicians, but we're not to think of them as magicians with a top hat pulling a rabbit out. That's not the kind of idea. Instead, the Magi of the ancient world were the scholars. They were the philosophers. They were the seers. They were the advisors to royalty and to rulers. They were the people who would interpret dreams when people had troubling dreams. They would look to the future and try and predict what was coming in the future. They were the scholars and intellectuals of the ancient world. So the Magi, when we think of them, we're not to think of kings. We're probably almost better to think of the ancient equivalent of university professors. That's really who they were. They were scholar philosophers. The problem is that the word magi tells us something about how many of them in pagan cultures went about their business. You see, they used magic. And so often the Old Testament law will condemn these figures in foreign cultures because they lent into things like the occult and black magic and divination that were condemned in the Old Testament law. But these magi, these scholar philosophers, are a little different. They're presented here in Matthew's gospel enacting in a good way as they come seeking the King of the Jews. So rather than imagining we three kings of Orient, we should be thinking about these scholar philosophers from some kind of foreign culture. So second question, how many were there? Well, we three kings is what we generally sing, but the only reason we think there's 3 is because there are 3 gifts talked about at the end of the story. Matthew never tells us how many there are. And in fact, as I've scanned a number of commentaries and read a number of scholars on this, the general thinking seems to be there was probably more than 3. There's no hint that the tradition of 3 came out of the number of gifts and kind of came centuries later. The reality is may well have been 7 or 11 or 18. So we're really killing the carol, by the way. 18 scholar philosophers of Orient, except they weren't from the Orient. If you think that Orient means Chinese ethnicity or something like that. Because what Matthew says is they came from the east. And the consensus is they probably come from Arabia or Persia or Babylon. If you think Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, somewhere in that vicinity of the world. And interestingly enough, all 3 of those places had large Jewish communities in them, which is significant, as we will see. So these unknown number of scholar philosophers turn up in Jerusalem. Why? Because they have followed a star. That's what they go around Jerusalem saying. We saw his star when it rose and we've come to worship him. So what is the star that they have seen? Well, there's speculation on that too. The reality is that we don't know a lot about these mysterious folks. It could be that the star was some natural phenomenon in the heavens. So one suggestion that has been made is that it was Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet cruised through at about 12 BC. Now, Jesus wasn't born in 0 BC. I'm sorry to tell you, the monk who calculated BC AD, he was out by 5 or 6 years. So Jesus was born about 5 or 6 AD. So Halley's Comet's not quite the right timing. Astronomers tell us that there was an event around 6 BC where the planets Saturn and Jupiter and Mars all lined up. And that would have looked pretty spectacular in the night sky. So it's possible it was a natural phenomenon like that. My hunch, though, is it wasn't some natural event, some particular star or something they saw. I think what they saw was something more supernatural and miraculous. I think God actually provided a sign for these scholar philosophers to come and hunt for Jesus. And the reason I think that is because over in verse 9, the way it's described, we'll come to this shortly, but here's what verse 9 says. After they heard the king, the Magi went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose, it went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now that sounds pretty specific to me, that there is some kind of star or shining object that as they're leaving Jerusalem, it goes ahead of them so they can follow it until it stops over the exact house where they'll find Jesus. That to me reads more like, if you know some of the stories of the Old Testament, it reads more like the pillar of fire that would move in front of the nation of Israel through the Exodus and then stop when they needed to camp. So my hunch is that the star, it may have been something natural, but I kind of tend to believe it was probably some miraculous sign that God gave these particular guys so that they would know what to follow. And the star actually was very, very significant. One of the oldest books in the Old Testament is the book of Numbers. And in Numbers, there is another Magi, a foreign philosopher, scholar, prophet by the name of Balaam. He was paid by a foreign king to curse the nation of Israel, and God wouldn't allow him to do that. Instead, he blessed them. And as part of his blessing, here is what Balaam, this foreign Magi, had said centuries before. Numbers 24. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. In other words, he's talking about a figure who is to come, the coming king. And we know it's a king because of what he says in the next line. Balaam said, a star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. So what Balaam had predicted centuries before was that there was a king who was going to come. That's what's symbolized by the scepter. A king is going to rise in the nation of Israel at some point, and the symbol of his coming will be a star. Now, Magi and these scholars around the ancient world were very learned around the writings of other religious faiths and beliefs and so on. And whether they came from Arabia or Persia or Babylon, we don't know, but there were Jewish communities in every one of those areas. So it's highly probable that these scholar philosophers knew of the prophecy of this former Magi from centuries before, that the anointed one, the coming king of Israel, would arrive, and when he arrived, there would be a star. And so one day they're studying the heavens, and they see this star appear that has never been there before. And they remember this prophecy, and they connect the dots, and they jump on their camels, and they turn up in Jerusalem going, we've seen the star. Where's the King of the Jews? We've come to worship him. Now, their arrival causes a stir. And the stir that it raises is at the heart of what the story is all about. Let me read verses 1 and 2 for us again, because I want you to see something very, very important. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, Matthew says, during the reign of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born, the King of the Jews? Now, it's a really basic observation, but what I want you to see in these opening verses is that there are actually two kings. And what's at the heart of the story is actually not these mysterious scholars at all. It's the two kings that Matthew introduces us to. One of the kings is the one who has just been born. That's symbolized today by this manger here on stage. That's who the Magi have come to find. That's who these scholars have come to seek out based on this ancient prophecy from Numbers 24, the King of the Jews. But what's happening at the same time, Matthew tells us, is there's another king. And he deliberately puts this right up front. After Jesus had been born during the reign of King Herod. And the second king, King Herod, is symbolized here by the throne. See, this story is ultimately not about these scholars, but about the two kings at the heart of the story. The newborn king and the current king. King Herod had been on the throne of Israel at this point for about 35 years. He was a puppet king of the nation of the Roman Empire. The Romans had conquered Israel in 63 BC, and after about a few decades, they had put this guy on the throne, King Herod. He was titled, here's his title, King of the Jews. But he wasn't even Jewish. He was actually from the ancient peoples of Edomite. But he weaseled his way onto the throne. The Romans put him on the throne. He became the King of the Jews. And for the next 30-something years, he knocked off every single person who might be a threat to the throne. He was a paranoid, murderous, merciless ruler. He killed at least one of his wives, of whom he had a few, but he killed one of them because he suspected her of treachery. He killed 3 of his sons who he thought were trying to steal the throne off him. He murdered countless ones of his subjects all over the land, because anyone who was a threat to his rulership and his throne was wiped out. And that's what Matthew wants us to understand as he begins the story of these scholars that turn up. They turn up into Jerusalem saying, "Where is the one born the King of the Jews?" Why? Because Jerusalem's the capital city. If the newborn king has been born, a fulfillment of this ancient prophecy, well, it must be at the palace. So they turn up in Jerusalem. Where's the King of the Jews? And the dude that the Romans made the King of the Jews is going, "Dude, what's going on here?" So Matthew then tells us in verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. That's one of the great understatements of the Bible. This guy was paranoid as. So when he hears that someone else is turning up claiming his title, this murderous, merciless king kicks into action. And the problem is, the whole population knows when Herod's on the warpath, watch out. No one's safe. No one's guaranteed. It could be your door that the soldiers come barging through as Herod seeks to take out anyone who's a threat to his throne. So he was disturbed, verse 3 says, and all Jerusalem with him. Because, man, if he's agitated, we all need to be worried. So verse 4 then says, then Herod called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, and he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. So he works out that these scholars have arrived because of this ancient prophecy in the book of Numbers. That all of the scholars would say was the announcement of a coming Messiah. Now, the Israelites have been waiting for centuries at this point for their Messiah, their anointed one, the son of David, to show up. So Herod calls all the religious leaders of Israel together and says, okay, here's my question. Where was Messiah meant to be born? Where are we meant to send these guys? And the scholars all say, oh, that's easy. It's in Bethlehem of Judea. Now, Bethlehem was not a significant place. You'd be struggling to even call it a town. It was a sleepy little village. It had one gas station and a pub, and that was about it. There was really not a lot there and not a lot to it, and it wasn't particularly famous except for one significant point. It was the hometown of the greatest king Israel had ever had, King David. And Micah the prophet, who is who the scholars will go on to quote in the very next verse, the scholars say, Micah said that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem of Judea. That's what they say in verse 5. This is what the prophet has written. So what Herod does is he calls the Magi back to him in verse 7. He called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go, search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report back to me so that I too may go and worship him. Do you remember those Tui beer ads years ago? Yeah, right? This could be a yeah, right billboard. Here's Herod, this despot, this tyrant, this heartless ruler who has taken out everyone who's been a threat to his kingdom for more than 30 years. saying to these foreign scholars, hey, you go to Bethlehem, work out where the child is, and then come and tell me, because I want to go and worship him. Now, the Magi have no idea, probably, just what kind of paranoid tyrant they are dealing with. But at the end of the story in verse 12, God will reveal to them in a dream that they are not to go back to Herod and they are to go on their way. Because Herod is not interested in worshipping the Messiah. Herod is interested in taking out anyone that is a threat to his power and kingdom. So the Magi leave Jerusalem and they make the 6-mile journey to Bethlehem. In verse 9 that we read earlier, we'll read it again. After they'd heard the king, they went on their way. And the star that they had seen previously, when it arose, now went ahead of them until it stopped over the very place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, in the nativity plays that happen around the world, the wise men arrive on the scene in the stable where everyone's crammed in and the shepherds are there and everything else. But that's likely not what is actually happening in this story. Notice earlier in verse 7 where Herod calls the Magi into the secret meeting and he asks them exactly when the star appeared. In the next part of the story, which we'll come back to in a couple of weeks, he will then send his soldiers to the sleepy little village to slaughter every little boy under the age of 2 years old. So what that means is he calculated from when the star first appeared, according to these scholars, that by this point, this so-called newborn king was probably somewhere between the age of 1 and 2. So when we imagine the scene with these scholars coming to worship Jesus, we're imagining turning up and there's a manger, and I've got a manger here on the stage today, but the reality is Jesus probably wasn't an infant at this point. He's a child in a house in Bethlehem. So he's probably between the ages of 1 and 2. So he's a toddler. Maybe he'd started to walk and here's Jesus kind of tottering around, holding on to furniture. Maybe he was drooling because he was cutting a fresh tooth. Maybe he was learning to just say his first words, Abba, Mama. And these wise men turn up and find this drooling toddler who's still being toilet trained. And they bow down and they worship this toddler as the King of Kings. And they bring these amazing gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And it may be there's a symbolic meaning to these, gold signifying royalty, frankincense being the incense that was burned to a god, symbolizing his divinity, myrrh, which was the burial perfume, perhaps pointing to his death and resurrection. But what's also clear is that these gifts were simply gifts of incredible value that ambassadors and emissaries around the world would bring when they came to visit royalty. And in fact, these gifts also fulfill ancient prophecies from the Old Testament. Isaiah the prophet, which was another prophet in the Old Testament, Isaiah had said this in Isaiah chapter 60, "Arise, shine, for your light has come and the glory of Yahweh rises upon you," predicting the coming birth of Messiah. Isaiah said, "Nations will come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn." It's this verse probably that the We Three Kings line comes from. But a few verses later, Isaiah will say this, "Herds of camels will cover your land, bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of Yahweh." Isaiah predicted 600 years before that there would come a day when Messiah would be born and foreigners would come flocking to worship him, bringing these gifts. And that's exactly what happens in this story. So why do they bow down? Why do they bring these incredibly expensive gifts? Because these foreign scholar philosophers believe that as they stare at this drooling, tottering toddler, that he is nothing less than the King of the Jews. And not only the King of the Jews, folks. Matthew's chosen not to bring Jewish shepherds into the story, but these foreign visitors, because he's wanting us to understand this is not just the king of the Jews, this is the king of the world. This one they have found, taking his first hesitant steps, speaking his first few words, is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the ruler of all nations. So what do we do with this story? How do we approach this story as we come into this Christmas season? Well, I think for most of us, we see ourselves right here, don't we? Right alongside these wise men, these scholar philosophers. They come and they find Jesus and they bow down and they worship and pay homage. And for most of us, that's where we would picture ourselves, isn't it? The vast majority of us here are followers of Jesus. We've come to believe the claims that the Bible makes about him. We've come to believe that he is the King of the world. He is the Saviour who came to die for our sins and to rise again. And maybe you aren't at that point yet. You're checking this all out. You're investigating the claims of Jesus, and you're so welcome here to do that. But that's what most of us believe about him, isn't it? And so we imagine ourselves right here alongside these wise men and wise women of today who bow down and worship. But I want to suggest today that maybe we should also see ourselves in some other ways. See, I think this story is actually presenting to us three possible responses to Jesus as the King. And while we would like to all think we're here bowing down, maybe there's another couple of positions we need to stop and reflect on for a few minutes. Position number one is back here at the back of this little stage. This is where earlier I kind of positioned those religious scholars of Israel. The guys that King Herod went to and said, hey, where was Messiah to be born? And they said, oh, that's easy. We didn't even need to research that. He's going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. They knew the answer. They didn't have to go back to the scrolls. They knew instinctively Messiah's going to be born in Bethlehem. They just knew. Easy. Give us a hard question, Herod, for goodness sake. But here's what's fascinating about these particular characters in this story. None of them go to Bethlehem to see if it's true. Do they? We're never told that those religious scholars made the 6-mile trek down to the little village just down the road. See, it seems as though the religious leaders, they knew all the answers. They knew where Messiah would be born, but they couldn't be bothered going to check him out. They were too busy. They were too distracted. And how often is it that this is the position we find ourselves in? As we come into the Christmas season and the pace of life speeds up even more, and we're busily frantic, running around, getting stuff sorted for the season and buying gifts and going to all of the end of year functions, and we can be so busy and so distracted around Christmas that we seem to forget Christ in the middle of it. And it's not only Christmas itself, but that's all the way through the year, isn't it? It's so easy for us to be busy and distracted with our lives that rather than bowing to the King, we're off doing our own thing. We're distracted by other things, by our romance, by our career, by our friends, our sport, our studies, whatever it is. The second position is here at this throne, where King Herod sits, refusing to bow to a Messiah, but instead wanting to hunt him down. And we look at Herod in this story and think, well, that is certainly not us. We're nowhere near like this kind of murderous figure in the story. But I want us to look again here, because I think it's very easy for us to end up in this position at Christmas and all through the year. You see, Herod would not bow because he didn't want to relinquish the throne. And folks, that's so true of us in our lives at times, isn't it? So you can't bow to the King while you're still sitting on the throne. You can't bow to the King while you're still sitting on the throne. My favourite movie, if you know me, my favourite movies are the Lord of the Rings series. And in the first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, The hobbits have made it halfway through that movie. They've made it to the elfish establishment of Rivendell. They've made it to safety there, but they need to do something with the great ring of power that is at the heart of this story. And so a great council is formed from our Elrond, the leader of Rivendell, who summons wizards and noblemen and elves and dwarves, everyone to come together who wants to stand against the great enemy Sauron and do something about his ring. And Elrond says to them at this council, we have to destroy the ring. One of the noblemen here is the son of the steward of Gondor, one of the human kingdoms. And Boromir steps forward and he says, why destroy the ring? Why can't we use the ring against Sauron to defeat him? And another human steps up. His name is Aragorn. He's the character, the kind of an outdoorsman, a rough-looking ruffian of a guy who's escorted the hobbits to this point. And Aragorn steps forward and says to Boromir, we can't use the ring. There's so much evil in that thing. It would overpower us. We have to destroy it. And Boromir looks at the scruffy ranger from the north and says, and what would a ranger know of these things? To which a third character leaps to his feet. Legolas, one of the elves who is at this meeting, who's a friend of Aragorn, and he stands and he looks at Boromir and he says these amazing words. He says, this is no mere ranger. He is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and you owe him your allegiance. See, this rough-looking rogue of a man, this ranger from the north, was actually the longed-for king of Gondor. He was the king in disguise. And what Legolas tries to help Boromir, the nobleman, understand is that actually this is your rightful king and you owe him your allegiance. Folks, that's what Matthew is saying in his story, in his photo album, as he shows us the story of these scholar philosopher kings who come and worship. He's saying this may just be a child, this may just be a drooling toddler who's still learning to say a few words, but this is the king. And if he really is the king, then we owe him our allegiance. To come and bow alongside these mysterious wise men is to acknowledge that he is our king. And by bowing to the king, we are giving up our rights. We're giving up our agenda. We are giving up the control of our lives. Because when we bow to the king, we are saying yes to him. When we bow to the king, we're saying yes to his commands, however hard they are at times to fulfill. When we bow to the king, we are saying yes when he calls us to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him. When we bow to the king, we're saying yes when he tells us to love our enemies and do good to those who have hurt us deeply. When we bow to the king, we are saying yes when he calls us to be incredibly generous with what he's poured into our lives. When we bow to the king, we are saying yes to his command to forgive people who have hurt us deeply. When we say yes to the king, we are saying yes to his call to put our self-centeredness and our ambitions aside to serve other people. When we bow to the king, we are saying yes to his call to not worry and be anxious about our lives, but to trust him because he's good. When we bow to the king, we are saying yes to his command to pursue his kingdom and his righteousness and not worry about our lives. And here's what we need to understand. Whenever we say no to the king, whenever we choose to not obey what he says in his word, whenever we choose to not go with the promptings of his spirit, we're no longer bowing to the king. We're taking back the throne of our lives. And the challenge that Matthew wants us to hear as we come into this Christmas season, what child is this? He's the king. And if he really is the king, then we owe him our allegiance. You See, this is the key idea. Bowing to the King means relinquishing the throne of our lives. Bowing to the newborn King means relinquishing the throne of our lives. And whenever we take back control, whenever we fail to say yes, we're sitting back on the throne. So as we finish this morning, I just want to ask you a really simple question. We'd all like to believe that this is where we are with these wise men bowing before our King. But it's so easy, isn't it, to be here, busy, distracted. And it's also so easy to be here, deciding, no, I'm in charge. It's my life, thanks. But if Jesus really is the King, we owe him our allegiance. And bowing to him means relinquishing the throne. So this morning, as we look to enter into this Christmas season, 4 weeks from now will be Christmas Eve, I would invite you to stop and think, what does it mean to bow to Jesus as my King today? And if you've come in distracted today, if you've come in taking the throne again in some part of life, I want to invite you to come once again and bow once more. I just want to give you a moment just to talk to your King, and then I'll lead us in prayer. Lord Jesus, thank you that you are the King of Kings. You didn't just come as a helpless baby. You didn't just come as a toddler learning to walk, but you came as the King. And not just King of the Jewish people of that nation, but the King of the world. And you now invite us through this powerful story to come and kneel with wise men. To be wise men and women today who realize who you are and bow. And thank you for this reminder that to bow to you as our King means relinquishing all rights to the throne. And so, Lord, if we've been distracted from you, we pray that we'd come running back. Lord, if we've taken control in an area of our life, we pray you'd help us relinquish that again, so that we can bow and honor you as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords this Christmas. Amen. As we finish our service today, folks, we're going to celebrate communion together. We're going to take the bread and the juice in the way that Jesus invited us to do that. And as you come this morning to the table, I want to invite you to come and not necessarily physically kneel at the table. That might slow the line up a little bit. But I do want to invite you to come with a bowed heart. Come to your King. Accept these gifts from him again that symbolize his forgiveness and adoption and his love. And bow, relinquishing every part of your life to him. God bless.